Again, good morning and welcome to Anthropology 4310. I want to, at the beginning, of course, ask you about questions and things like that, but first, a few announcements. I understand that the handout for Lecture 4 and 5, which now turns out to be at least somewhat for Lectures 4, 5, and 6, is on the website, as well as your syllabus. The syllabus that's on the website is the accurate syllabus that the students here in the class have, except one disparity seems to be that the basic 4 requirements for the course are listed as 1, 2, 3, and 3. How that happened, I would never know, but whatever, it's okay. Just remember that after 3 comes 4, and you'll be fine, those of you in the home viewing audience. But things seem to be up to par. Also, the time or deadline has passed for those students who were to have selected a topic or area of theory for presentation. So now it's up to Mr. Webb and myself to appoint you or assign you to the slots that are left, those 20-some of you that are still left, and congratulations to the 60-some of you who had the wisdom to select on time. I acknowledge your wisdom. Okay, and as soon as we have those lists with the corresponding groups will also be placed on the websites. Hopefully we can, or website rather. Hopefully we can also get the email addresses for those students so that you can have them to share with each other and exchange, so that those of you who are the members of a particular group can start planning immediately for your group presentation in preparation for your own appearance here in the library on Channel 8 in this wonderful media environment. And I think you'll enjoy it, and you're going to have a lot of fun, although right now it may seem overwhelming and awesome. So that aside, we're still trying to learn how to put things on the website. My computer defies technology and has not allowed us to get beyond certain levels yet, even with all kinds of help. So we're going to either get a different computer or have a different route. But we'll get there, so don't worry about it. So now, are there any questions about anything that we've covered so far in lecture from those of you in the class, or even our student at the site location? Hi. Okay, no questions? All right, last time I had given you the handout, and we went over in fairly great detail, I thought, the 3 different assumptions, basic assumptions of the 19th century anthropologists. And we had begun then to go from that discussion of, if you will, psychic unity of mankind, parallel evolution, and the comparative method, to an examination of Tyler's, or rather Morgan's, his elaboration, his scheme for developing this kind of a step ladder or rungs, or whatever you want to call it, steps from savagery, the lower status of savagery, up to the what was civilization. In the 19th century, for whatever reason, in the Victorian era, there was a major concern with civilization and what it meant, and who was civilized and who wasn't. And that really informed a great deal, that discussion or that discourse that occurred concerning the other. You know, those that became the other were those who were kind of defined outside the parameters of civilization. And there was this kind of elite group of folks, meaning mostly people in England, some in Western Europe, although not all, and those of us in America, meaning in the United States and Canada, I suppose, were the in-group, so to speak, although I'm sure they didn't think of it or say it in those words. But they became very concerned with civilization, and as I said, according to your handout, on Morgan's stages in the development of civilization, he sees the major criterion for this stage of civilization as being the invention of a phonetic alphabet. that is what they considered to be, most of the writers at that time in the 19th century, that's mostly what they considered to be the distinguishing criteria. Today, that would not hold up. In other words, we still have stage theoreticians or stage theorists, right? But for civilization, we still have that concept. We still have that notion. We still have many people wanting to join that club, so to speak. It happens every time they have the gathering of the 8 leaders of the industrial world. Plus, you know, they'll say the 8 plus the premier of Russia, or president of Russia, excuse me. So I guess it's 8.5 or 8 3/4 or whatever. But today they would define it more like these other substages and stages have been defined, and that is along technological lines, and it would be primarily defined or separated out based on industrial technology. But even that is complicated because actually we probably have to add post-civilization stages, or maybe civilization needs to be divided into 3 substages now. One would be the civilization stage, let's say lower civilization, where you had industrial technology, middle civilization, where it might be defined as nuclear technology, and upper civilization, in other words, that's where we are, so that's how we define it, very ethnocentric, very Eurocentric, very Anglocentric, would be, although that's also Eurocentric to say that, isn't it? Because obviously the Japanese, the Chinese, and other Asian peoples have made contributions as well as people in South Asia. A tremendous development there of computers and computer technology, etc., that we don't often hear about here because we're so preoccupied with listening to ourselves. But I think that's a fair extension of this diagram beyond what anything that Morgan had anticipated or that even recent writers on stage theories in anthropology have commented on. Obviously it needs tremendous updating, and if we're to find utility in it. But there are many other things wrong with this particular scheme. But before we tear it apart, let's go ahead and talk a little more about what it means and what the significance of it was as seen by Morgan and his cohorts, meaning Tyler, Spencer, McLennan, Bachhofen, Marx, you name them, we got them. Okay. Looking at again, the stages and then just commenting on it. And this is in your handout. So if you think I'm going fast for you to take notes, you don't need to take notes because I'm merely going over what's said there, and then we'll comment on it. In this way, the classical evolutionists established by speculation a series of evolutionary stages in the development of law, the family, religion, and culture as a whole. The classical evolutionists searched the ethnographic literature, which was fairly meager at this point, for examples illustrative of each of these stages and also of these substages. When such examples were found, they felt that Morgan's scheme was validated. This comparative method was criticized severely by modern and later anthropologists. The way you look at that is go back to the scheme, if we can show it on the screen again. And for each one of these stages, civilization, and then the barbarism and its 3 subdivisions, and savagery, and its 3 subdivisions, you have to extend this diagram if you actually had Morgan's writing in front of you, and actually you do if you look at your text, and extend it to the right, and there you would have a column that would say law. Right. And then he would have various developments in that institution that we think of as law, and each development would correspond to one of these stages or substages in this scheme. He would also have then religion. Same kind of analysis would follow, or the same kind of listing would follow. Also family. And the way to think about it, again, remember it's a very ethnocentric point of view. But on the other hand, let's be kind to these gentlemen, and they were gentlemen, I don't know of any female writers at this time. Certainly not because they couldn't, because they weren't allowed to, and many different cultural kinds of barriers, etc. But primarily at this time, we have males to deal with, and that most hated example in current terms of Anglo males, who were even worse. Most of them were trained, as I think I told you before, lawyers. So they are to be despised in a joking way on many fronts. But again, obviously they were very ethnocentric. They were very self-centered. And they looked at themselves as the epitome of everything, much as they do today. Those same Anglo males who have an ethnocentric perspective, and maybe I can even add are lawyers and other nefarious occupations, tongue-in-cheek. In separating themselves from these other folks in the world, in distancing themselves by studying them and by labeling them the other, and by kind of a self-examination and saying, well, now where are we? You know, our family organization seems to be going into even at that point, in the latter part of the 19th century, one could detect a trend from that extended family that we associate with farms and agricultural contexts in the Western world. In the cities, some of the families were already going towards, quote, a nuclear family. I don't think they called it a nuclear family back then at all. But whatever their family organization was, however they saw it as developed and structured and what have you, they thought that was the best that humans had to offer. And again, that is how we define civilization, and this is what the family was like in terms of civilization. So then they would go back to what is least like that. What is the most opposite of that? What's the furthest away from that one can get? And that they would define then or locate in the lower status of savagery. And I've already given you my joke about the humping and gathering society, but that's where they would go. And then you would take all of the different kinship arrangements that they were able to isolate out or analyze from looking at that in that search of the ethnographic literature, and they would take those different kinds of family organization and they would locate them in this scheme. And again, it would be from that lower status of savagery to civilization. And when they got to civilization, of course, then it would be a nuclear family or an agricultural kind of extended family, bilateral, no depth to it, etc., such as we are familiar with in the Western world. And in between, they would have matrilineages and patrilineages and things like that. And there was a great debate, even in the 19th century. I don't think it's a hot item today, but in the 19th century, one of the hot items of debate among these scholars was which came first, matrilineal societies or patrilineal societies. Morgan et al. Felt that patrilineal societies were the first. Others felt that matrilineal societies deserve that place. And the reason that place had such, that people envied and wanted it in their own history, was that they felt that earlier stage of lineal arrangement, whether patrilineal or matrilineal, was somehow the natural way of being human. This is an interesting point, and one that goes back to the 19th century. And its environment, the environment which gives rise to that focus, is with us still today, only we don't see it in the same way. But the environment it's very anti-urban, it's very anti-intellectual, it's very anti-everything that I am. And the reason for that being is that you wanted to strip away the taint of civilization. You wanted to see humans in their natural state. You wanted to see human beings in their natural state because that would give you the best informed account of what human nature was about and like. So, back in the 19th century, if you were to say the first human communities were patrilineal, if they were organized and arranged around male figures, fathers, grandfathers, great-grandfathers, etc. However much in time that went back. For some societies, it went incredibly far back in time. For other societies, it was more limited to the knowledge that they had. After all, many of these communities that they're talking about didn't have written accounts. They didn't have that phonetic alphabet yet. So they were limited by what they could remember or their fathers and grandfathers could remember. Much the same as in your family. You know, I'm 60 now, and I can remember back to my grandparents, but I really have very little knowledge of my great-grandparents. I have a book that my mother gave me when she died 2 years ago that has all these photographs in it, and daguerreotypes. I think maybe you've seen those kind of photographs before. It's a whole book of them. I don't know who any of the people are, although I know they're all my mother's side of the family, and they're all interesting, and they're dressed in these funny clothes, and I love the pictures. But I would love to know also, who these people are and what they're about. But anyway, in the context of the 19th century, what that focus on whether the first communities were patrilineal or matrilineal, it had to do with what's the natural state, what's human nature about. Because if the natural state of humanity is to be patrilineal, that means then males occupy a more important position within any society and in any time. And matrilineal in that context then almost represents a deviation. Something's been thrown in the path to cause it to go off track. For example, say a society experiences migration, lots of migration. The males go somewhere else to work, or the males go somewhere else for whatever reason. And in that context, then what's left behind? Females. So yeah, society, you can find communities, Morgan and other folks would say, in which there is a predominance of males in that community, or excuse me, females who may even be in leadership positions, but it's temporary or artificial in nature. It really doesn't reflect human nature. Those that favored matrilineal societies and credit them with being those earlier forms that human communities took, as we were becoming more human or humanized, and that again goes back, I see in your schema here that Morgan provides us. Again, I see that in that fish subsistence notion there, because a lot of the folks that favor matrilineal societies is taking on an earlier importance, and patrilineal then would represent a deviation or artificial expression of human development. They found that because they said the first settlements were organized around, river areas or along the oceans or something like that, where fish and fish subsistence was most important. A gathering activity, which women would be very important, and which women would then be credited as being centralizing, organizing people. So that's what the argument took on in the 19th century. But I think that most of you are aware that that anti-urban, that anti-intellectual, that anti-scientific stuff is current to the present day in Western world. There's some kind of disparity as exemplified in such terms as, well, he's an egghead. Or in terms of commentary on schools these days, high schools and things like that, they'll talk about students as being nerds, or dorks. I think that's some of the terms. Surely they've evolved beyond that now in terms of their terminology, but those are the ones I know. And all of that represents this same kind of anti-urban, anti-intellectual, anti-knowledge, anti-scientific kind of bias, and a pro-agricultural, rural kind of outlook. If you can't find examples yourself in your own awareness, only look to the state legislature and see the kinds of legislation they pass. How many times it's anti-Houston or anti-Dallas or anti-San Antonio, and why there's much largesse extended towards more rural areas of our state. And it has to do with the values that are embedded in these kinds of notions. So what people thought in the 19th century stays with us today. It sometimes wears a different costume. Halloween is prevalent. But it's nonetheless the same kind of underlying fundamental issue or theme that's being sounded, or it resonates with us. And even those of us who who are choosing careers, maybe those of you in this class that would be towards the academic, towards knowledge, towards urban kinds of concerns, towards university kinds of life. Even you and even I have all kinds of values that are embedded back in this 19th century and in this 19th century view of what humans are about. All right. I've already told you now that he has these various substages and stages, and that he elaborates on them, not only with the family in the way I just described it or discussed it, but say with religion it would be what's the opposite of a belief in one deity, a monotheism, which we associate with the world's great traditions, religious and otherwise, and that certainly in our own country there would at least be three major ones. It would be, well, more than three. Well, Christian, if I do it that way, Christian and Jewish and Muslim. Those would be the three great traditions, but there are all kinds of lesser traditions, and lesser only in the sense of membership, numbers, etc. But those would be then defined as what's modern, what's most current, what comes with that level we call civilization. And really, when we look at it from a point of view such as we find here, that Morgan and other writers at this time were trying to present, that kind of evolution in religious society or in religious organization had to do with exactly that, its organization. It doesn't mean that there weren't some fundamental beliefs, religious outlooks, religious values that didn't go from one stage of of cultural development to the next. It does mean that, however, that religious hierarchy, the clerical organization, it evolved to becoming a much more class-ridden or class-described kind of entity. And if for those of you who had other courses in anthropology, you know about this development in earlier, more simple stages of society and culture known as the shaman. And I'm sure maybe some of you have read about it. If you've ever read anything about witchcraft, modern-day witchcraft in terms of the way it's practiced, or if you've read about other kinds of folks, simpler organizations, you know that there is this figure of the shaman that exists and that anthropologists talk about, whether they were back at this time or whether they're even in a modern-day Introduction to Cultural Anthropology class. And the shaman represents a religious figure, an individual, relatively unorganized. And what the priest, which would be someone we would associate with a more current time, what that represents really is just an evolution towards more complex organization. And in some ways, that's what social evolution has been about. It's about an increasing complexity of social organization. And that's what's represented in the different kinds of substages and stages that go along in this diagram that I've given you or provided for you from Morgan. If you were to have the information about the gradual evolution of religious institutions. Again, it doesn't mean that those religious traditions lost values or changed values dramatically, although in some cases they did, of course. But it does mean that the social organization, the complexity of it, changed tremendously. And that's what you find. Think of the Pope, think of the Vatican, think of the incredible bureaucratic organization that implies, and that there are somewhat comparable institutional arrangements for also Protestant denominations and also for Muslims and for the Jewish folks. But it doesn't necessarily represent that concentration of power in one figure, the Pope, but it does represent social complexity, increasingly complex social organization. So, again, this is a viewpoint of culture and of society and institutional arrangements and their evolution as one that's highly tied or closely connected with technological developments and technological change, right? And that's what this whole schema is developed on. And if you look to your handout, that next page, many modern anthropologists would agree with Morgan that productive technology, the tools and techniques whereby a people exploit their natural environment, is the basic aspect of every culture. And therefore, of culture in general. That's a very materialist point of view. If you ever want to know, ever want a definition of that materialist perspective in anthropology that transcends any one generation, here it is. And it's the one that shows such a great deal of reliance upon technology as being the explanatory criterion. And then they go on, and this is also very materialist. It would fit in almost any archaeology course today, and in many other anthropology courses as well. And they say, your authors here, Barton and Schwartz, a culture is an adaptation to a total environment, and the single most important factor in that adaptation is technology. A culture is an adaptation to a total environment, and the single most important factor in that adaptation is technology. All they mean by total environment is the environment that's not only the physical, biological environment, the earth, etc., but also the social and cultural environment. So it's a total environment. And humans adapt to different environments in the first level of adaptation by their technology. Hunting and gathering peoples, for example, are very dispersed organizations of peoples. They're one of the first kinds that has been isolated out since this was written is what's called a patrilineal hunting band, and that represented about 50 people. And the person who was the head of those 50 people would have been the grandfather or the great-grandfather, who's ever the oldest living male. It would represent a group of people in which there was kind of a collective, supportive, mutually supportive arrangement and work effort. If we looked at the organizational labor on the part of males, they would be hunters, but they wouldn't just be individual hunters. They would be hunters in a group, and they would use that group effort to bring down the animals, etc. And if I'm thinking in prehistoric times, I think of Native Americans in this country who, one of the most interesting ones I've read about and heard about has been when they hunted bison. And this was before the reintroduction of the horse to the Western Hemisphere. Because I think most of you know, if you know anything about evolution, that the horse was originally evolved in the New World, then with the movement of the continents, etc. It was left in the Old World and kind of got out of the New World, wasn't there. But then when the Spanish came back, they brought the horse with them, and they reintroduced the horse. So when you read about horses on the plains, it comes to us from the Spanish culture and from that kind of cultural acculturation process, if you will, and doesn't represent the fact that we domesticated horses here, and etc. Rather, it's a long, complicated, prehistorical, pre-human kind of phenomena, which intrigues me in some ways. But what they would do with these horses, these Plains Indians, before horses, these Plains Indians, is they would spy, say, a buffalo herd. If you've ever been to South Dakota today or some of that area of the country, you've seen these buffalo herds. Buffalo are kind of like cows. I mean, in the sense, if you look at them, they're fairly, they just kind of stand there, and if you go up to them, which I have done as a younger child, and they don't really respond very much, But in large herds, which is what they existed like before, at this time that I'm talking about, prehistoric times, the plains area was full of large herds of buffalo, off of which these Native Americans lived. And the way they would, this is a pretty big animal. Think of it as large at least as a cow. And how do you get one of those? I want me one of those buffalo. Well, the way they did it as a group, they would start the buffalo stampeding. And they wouldn't just have them stampede anywhere. They would have them go in a certain direction so that they would go over the cliffs. Well, buffalo are like that, just like cattle are like that. If you get them going in a certain direction and they come to the edge of this precipice, they don't say, "Ooh, got to put the brakes on." No, they go over, and then these groups, these prehistoric groups in the plains area of in our country, what's today our country, they would have had a great feast. Of course, they didn't have refrigeration, so whatever they couldn't consume rather immediately got, rotted or whatever, which might account also for the development of jerky. For beef meat, if you've ever had that, Slim Jims, it takes goes way back to this time and to this kind of endeavor in terms of their origin, because they found, or these Native Americans found, they could preserve meat with salt, etc., and it would last much longer, and they would have somewhat of a stable food supply, although obviously not nearly as stable as that which is associated with agricultural kinds of communities. Which comes at that later barbarism or barbarian levels of cultural development. So anyway, I'm not wanting to spend that long a time, but I am wanting you to realize that this is par excellence a statement of cultural materialism, and this is where I would associate these folks in the 19th century. That's where the pendulum was. It was very much towards that end of the continuum between humanism and materialism, towards a materialistic viewpoint and outlook. And as I say, it's interesting that even though later anthropologists severely criticized the particulars of this evolutionary scheme of stages and substages, they don't reject it altogether. Those schemes are still with us. Now, I've even suggested some refinements as I've gone along in the lecture and talking about how maybe civilization might be divided into 3 substages now. And that will go on forever if you take this stage kind of point of view. And that's really not, the philosophy of science, scientific construction of theory that you might get in a logic course, but this is the way theory is constructed in this kind of general discussion by anthropologists in their own history. This was the first point of view that was well developed, and it was heavily borrowed from the Enlightenment, or that earlier period. But obviously by the 19th century, or the end of the 19th century, they did have some more information. They were more aware, somewhat, of ethnographic information of people around the world, even though the ethnography that they had, the ethnographic data that they had, was distorted, was tainted, was not objective, etc. But one could say that today. I mean, if jumping way ahead of ourselves, if one can take seriously, and I do, a postmodern approach, a more humanities kind of oriented approach, one that many of you have been trained in, if you take that kind of approach, then you still say that ethnography is tainted. I think it's in the nature of ethnography itself to have all kinds of problems when it's placed in the context of the philosophy of science. Quantitative methodology, no matter how much we espouse it, those of us in anthropology, and no matter how popular it has become in the present day among government bureaucrats, among people in the colleges of education, among all kinds of folks dealing in all kinds of research that have suddenly discovered qualitative methodology. It really is a very uncomfortable fit, this notion of qualitative research and scientific method. But we keep trying. And postmodernists, of course, would have us go totally outside of the scientific framework and keep the benefits or the good points about ethnography and continue the ethnographic adventure, whereas some folks in natural sciences and in social sciences, the more heavily they emphasize science at the expense of social, the more they're going to downplay the value or quality, even, although I'm using that kind of funny now, of qualitative methodology or ethnography. And for those of you who haven't that much background in ethnography, or in anthropology rather, it is that great contribution, I think, one of the great seminal contributions that anthropology has made, and that is you plop yourself down in the middle of another culture and you start observing and you start taking notes, and it's that personal interaction, it's that being on the scene. It's not what these folks were talking about. They weren't ethnographers. They were observers from afar. After all, it was the other they were talking about, and they didn't really want to associate with the other. They wanted to distance themselves from the other. That's why they called it the other. those other folks, those other classes, that other gender. That when we other something, we objectify it, we dismiss it, we label it, we categorize it, we make it lesser. But that wouldn't bother someone who's in the latter part of the 19th century. That's the way things were supposed to be. Of course they're lesser. Of course they're, different, etc. Again, but it comes back to this point, which was the third assumption, which I've labeled here somewhat tentatively, the comparative method. If we look, as I say in the handout, at the Arunta, and everyone is familiar with the Arunta, whether they know it or not. If you've seen one of those pictures of, I can't even think of his name now, the fellow from Australia that has in all those movies. What's his name? Somebody tell me. Yeah, what is it? Say it. Yeah, no, not Indiana Jones. That's not. Crocodile Dundee. All the native peoples in those movies, there would have been Arunta if they were back in their original areas of Australia, etc. So they're a group that are familiar with you. And one of the things I really loved about observing Australian films is the different portrayals one gets of Aborigines in that area. Peter Weir, W-E-I-R, is a person who makes films in Australia, and he has, the Aborigines are always in the background, but they're there. The story is always Eurocentric again, or Anglocentric, or Australocentric, whatever the word would be. So the story is always about what's going on in the elite. But, hanging around in the background, the class providing all the good things in life would be the Aborigines, and they wouldn't be focused on, but they obviously would be filmed. And so you get that glimpse. You get other glimpses of it in Crocodile Dundee, a friendlier view of the Australian Aborigine, but nonetheless, not exactly within the elite of that area. And also not exactly like their ancestors would have been. But if we look at their ancestors, even if we go out into the bush, which is a term appropriate to Australia, if we go out into the rural hinterlands far enough and we come across communities in those areas, they would live a more traditional way of life. We have a way of thinking. We have a way in the West of thinking that distance equals time. So from urban centers. So the further out you go from an urban center, the more rural the location is, the further back in time you go. When I was in Mexico my first time in 1962, I was living in an Indian village outside of Tepoztlán, not that far from Cuernavaca, called San Andrés de la Cal. And in that community there was when they wanted to iron, they had these kind of iron things that looked like an iron, but they would put hot coals or wood embers in that iron, and they would iron their clothes. In this rather humble environment, in my mind, would come out, children's clothes who went to school just really well pressed and starched and white as can be, and kids looked great and happy and all those kinds of things. And then I came home and told my mother about that, and she said, "Oh, well, we had those when I was a kid. When I grew up on the farm, my family in Indiana had an iron very similar. Today we think of steam irons, and irons really haven't evolved that much, so it's kind of a poor example. But on the other hand, I think you get my point, and that is, in your own personal experiences, in your own families, you get this notion. But also in the anthropological literature, which is not something I talk about here in the handout, that there is this kind of thinking that geography equals time. There's somehow a correlation. So again, the further out you go from an urban center or away from an urban center, the more into a rural environment, and indeed maybe even beyond what one can call rural, you would then find something maybe even very akin to prehistoric. But when they're talking about those kinds of similarities, when you're talking about that you can find savages, Stone Age peoples today, it really doesn't mean, and this would be one of the criticisms, I think, that it doesn't really mean they replicate or they duplicate cultures from the past. It means in terms of their organization, their complexity, that it's similar to groups from the past, and that one of the main generalizations that one can make about cultural evolution or technological changes and adaptations by human communities would be that as time has passed, they have become incredibly more complex in their social organization. And think about what's going on right now. The incredible evolution of complexity of organization that's occurring. I don't think it's as far, as extensive or intensive as Sunday morning commercials would have you believe, that there's fisher people all over the world looking at their laptops, seeing what the markets are so they can know whether to fish or not. That's a bit of an exaggeration, and again, a bit of a Eurocentric point of view. But there are people in Hong Kong, many people in Hong Kong, many people in different areas of the world that are extensively sophisticated in terms of technological developments, especially computers, and what that affords in terms of markets and economies and what influences economies, etc. In fact, I'm sure many of them know much more about it than I do. But in that, anyway, it's just when I think of the incredible complexity that all that involves, I'm overwhelmed with the way in which it's going on right now. We're in the middle of it, and we remain unaware of it. You know, cultural evolution is still occurring, and in fact, it's occurring at a much more seemingly rapid rate than it has occurred in the past. After all, going from the lower status of savagery to the beginning of agriculture, or that lower status of barbarism, took thousands, if not millions, of years. I mean, although we only credit, human Homo sapiens sapiens as being around, well, when I was in graduate school, they said 75,000 years, and they keep extending those things back in time, so I'm not sure what the current guesstimate is, but it would certainly not be yesterday, and it would not be within known historical time. And indeed, it goes back further and further as we find out more and more, and the records are more completely filled in. Even though that occurs, and even though we have that slow development there, say, when we get to barbarism, when we get to agricultural technology, the change is a little faster. And we have the beginnings of cities 10,000 years ago. Just 10,000 years ago. An anthropologist can say that. When you say it 10,000 years ago, it sounds like a very old person. One who's even gone beyond Social Security. But for an anthropologist, 10,000 is relatively brief when we look at the total. It's just a pinpoint in the history of humans and of human both biological and cultural evolution. So all the things that occurred as a result of agriculture has occurred within the past 10,000 years. Industrialization is not yet 200 years old in terms of a technological innovation and all the ramifications of that technology. Computer technology is not yet, I'm going to guess and say 30 years old, certainly in terms of impact. I can remember when I was a graduate student, I coexisted with HAL at the University of Illinois. If any of you have seen Space Odyssey 2001, and we were all excited. And you go to the movies and you could clap, the audience would always applaud whenever HAL, the computer, the large mammoth computer, talked to the two astronauts that were in that ship going somewhere, Enterprise or whatever. And so it was a point of pride for us. But now, I mean, my Lord, that bulky, forgive me, Hal, a computer mammoth where you saw the tapes rolling like you see in the commercials today for Charles Schwab, and I don't mean to give free advertisement here. But when you see that and you think of those large computers that had the tapes and everything, those are not, that's not what made the revolution. Obviously, the revolution has come about even more through the development of personal computers and the fact that you all have computers. The fact that this course is a part of the technological ramification of computer technology and of the electronicization of this society. The kinds of ramifications that has in terms not only of social and cultural complexity, but in terms of changes of value changes in attitude. But on the other hand, as we'll see as I have these discussions and digressions throughout the course, whenever we, in digressions, you can sometimes find some of the richest of comments, I think, because they represent commentaries that come from me. And that's my own personal contribution to what I think would otherwise might be a more sterile discussion of these issues. When we look at the digressions that I'll give you, you'll see that I'm constantly talking about the kinds of that interaction between technology, environment, and culture. I'm a dyed-in-the-wool materialist in terms of arranging things, in the terms of categorizing things, in terms of viewing things. And it is not that I don't recognize the contribution of humanistic points of view, as you'll discover later on. It's simply that this is the way I was trained. This is where anthropology has its first really thorough grounding and expression, and it informs subsequent eras or periods in anthropology. So, as it says in your handout, therefore if a living people like the Arunta of Australia have a technology much like that which archaeology demonstrates to have been characteristic of Upper Paleolithic man, that's a anthropological 75-cent expression which means Upper Stone Age, something prehistoric. 20,000 years ago, they say, that might be true in Australia. We have a justifiable basis for correspondence between other aspects of Upper Paleolithic culture and Arunta culture. I think only in terms of the social organization. Archaeologists are really adept at recovering or social reconstruction by looking at the data that's left behind. But as any humanistic archaeologist might tell you, they really have much more difficulty when it comes to a reconstruction of values or reconstruction of religious attitudes and perceptions. They can do it to a certain level, a certain extent, but they can't recover it totally. There's always a limitation. But there's always, then again, that envelope against which they push and in which each succeeding generation of archaeologists seems to come closer and closer. But anyway, here we go. We have this they feel a correspondence between other aspects of Upper Paleolithic culture and Arunta culture. It is true, possibly, that some aspects of contemporary traditional Aboriginal Arunta culture is something that can be talked about in terms of other examples of Upper Stone Age cultures found around the world, in Europe, say, or what have you. But I want to leave you with one caveat about this particular approach, and that is I think that the stage theory, which is what this is, of anthropology, is really very biased towards those stages of cultural development, as what this is about, from savagery to barbarism to civilization. It's very biased in content towards Europe. If you take a course in Old World archaeology, you've got this same scheme of Morgan's backwards and forwards, except they elaborate, they bring it up to date, they modify it to a certain extent, but you've got the basis of it right here. But if you go to other areas of the world, you can find corresponding chapters, corresponding epochs, corresponding notions of savagery, barbarism, and even civilization that will apply, but they won't necessarily follow the same developments that occurred in the Old World, and by the Old World we mean Europe. When I think of really wonderfully carved out of stone Mousterian blades and other kinds of cultural examples that they've left behind in terms of that Stone Age technology. If you see a very finely crafted stone knife that's very intricate and has all kinds of squiggles and things in it, and then you start appreciating or think about what that must have required. That there had been a lot of evolution of notion, that the artisanship was, the craftsmanship, just the sheer ability to do that, how long that had taken in terms of human prehistory to get to that point, to be able to develop those fine, exquisite tools. And if you've never seen them, go visit with Dr. Widmer and let him show you some of them. I'm always overwhelmed when I see them. and especially when I start appreciating them from the point of view of what had to go into that. Not in terms of the individual skill of the individual artifact that you're seeing, because you realize that that was a tradition, that was already a complex that existed that many different artisans shared in, and maybe there was some competition if they had those values, but nonetheless it represented the byproduct of centuries, even millennia of development when we talk about the development of these stone tools. Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could be just a little more specific. You say that this structure is biased towards Europe. Mm-hmm. Could you maybe compare that to like the evolution in Asia, or?
Well, again, we can find those rough outlines. We can find examples of savagery. We can find examples of barbarism. We can find civilization. We don't necessarily find Mousterian. Mousterian, M-O-U-S-T-E-R-I-A-N, which is just an example of a upper Stone Age, if you will, culture or group of people in different scattered sites throughout Europe that represented a certain level of sophistication with respect to Stone Age tools. We call it the Mousterian period. Many times it's associated with some Neanderthal remains. You would find some cultural byproducts associated with, say, Neanderthals in that area, but it wouldn't necessarily be Mousterian. So that's what I mean. It's the most thoroughly documented is the one in Europe. So it's the one that influences, I think, the way folks in lithic archaeology present things or think about things, because it's the one they know most about. It's the one that's most thoroughly documented. I took some courses when I was a graduate student at University of Illinois, and at that time, they offered us a course, or at least glimpses of a course, because the course was much larger than that, about archaeology and prehistory in Africa. And in the 1960s, anyway, when I was a graduate student, they didn't really know much about it, so it was a very thin volume. I'm sure now it's been expanded tremendously. But again, it's because I think they kept looking for duplicates of what occurred in Europe and what had occurred in the development of the Old World, Upper Stone Age and Lower Stone Age and things like that, that kind of bias people away from appreciating what other areas of the world might have had to offer in terms of those things. So again, that's a point that I hadn't made, and that is that this also includes human ancestors when we look at that. I'm not sure that always Morgan would have been that sophisticated. He certainly knew or had glimpses of those prehistoric populations of Neanderthals and Homo erectus populations, Pithecanthropus. I would associate those, when I think back on my own knowledge of these things, I associate fire with Pithecanthropus, with Homo erectus. I associate Neanderthals with various other kinds of developments, including some in agriculture. And I may be screwing this whole thing up a bit just because of my lack of knowledge here, but I certainly, Cro-Magnon, where he or she come into play, most importantly is in domestication, that middle status of barbarism, and also development of melding ores, iron, whether it be iron ore or other kinds of metal manipulation. So it's even a prehistoric accounting here. Okay. So Elman Service, in a similar discussion in his book, has asked, but if the aboriginal culture of the Arunta is not a form of adaptation to a particular kind of total environment made long ago and preserved into modern times because of its isolation, then what is it? Are they not representatives of an ancestral form of culture? And he refers to them in his volume as contemporary ancestors. And Morgan anticipated this argument when he related the general level of cultural development to subsistence technology. But their attempt, these 19th century folks, these classical evolutionists, to discover origins and then trace subsequent developmental stages for the family, religion, or law, were almost completely discredited by their successors. This rejection took different forms among different scholars. And why do they say that? Well, look around the world today. If you look at the religious evolution, let's look at an institutional example. Let's take religion, and hoping not to offend anyone out there or here. The kinds of ideas and concepts that we associate, or these folks associated with some of these lower stages of cultural development, I can find in Houston. Now, does it mean because if I find them in Houston, this represents a savage people living in modern day environments? I don't think so. I think they're just as informed. I think they're just as sophisticated. They're just as aware. They're just as human as I am in my wonderful position here as an ivory tower academic. No, it's not that they somehow missed the boat and they misconstrue things and I got it right. It's that ideas never leave us. That's when remember I referred to a book some time ago that came out, I believe, in the 70s, Alvin Toffler's The Third Wave. And one of the contributions that he adds to these kinds of discussions is that these institutional arrangements that evolve, the social complexity that evolves, even the attitudes and the values, those very things that we most completely identify with cultural developments, they never go away. That's what we mean by complex. They keep being added and added and added and added. But again, in some ways, from my own perspective, there's some cliches that apply here, and that is change always occurs, but the more things change, the more they remain the same. It's in that they're more remaining the same that you find these great identifications with different cultural traditions. I remember attending a lecture about, I was a graduate student and I had to take notes on this course. It was the way I got money as a graduate student, and it was on Asian cultures, and the person was trying to make this point that yes, you had Chinese civilization and you had all these various different kinds of subcultures within China, and then came this overlay of communism, and this was way before Reagan had ever cracked the the Berlin Wall or whatever, and the Soviet Empire had fallen and communism was made to go to the hovel where it was supposed to be, and I'm kidding. But his point was that even with this overlay, this seeming overlay of communist ideology and values, that underlying all that was still the great resilience, the great tenacity of these traditional values and attitudes that represented different earlier stages in Chinese culture. Same thing that one might say, for example, today about the Balkans. All this enmity, where does all this hatred come from? Where do all these values about how those folks aren't very good and we're wonderful come from? They deserve to be killed, we deserve to occupy everything and take it over. Where a lot of that comes from is the traditional culture of that area. The Balkans have been a problem for modern politicians from the beginning of this century to the present. This isn't something new. There were overlays of communism in that area as well that seemingly eradicated those cultural differences. They didn't go anywhere. They stayed, went from father to son to grandson, from grandmother to daughter to granddaughter to great-granddaughter, etc. And those people retain those attitudes and those values. Look into yourselves. You'll find much more cultural identification with traditional values than you realize. And again, as the election years warm up and politicians begin to speak, you'll be able to identify now, I hope, much of the social Darwinistic kinds of values and attitudes and beliefs that they continue to evidence and evoke. And the reason that our heart pounds a little faster, the reason we seem to think that they have finally gotten insight is because they're telling us things we've heard since we were babes in our mother's arms. And we have that benefit of revealed insight. But it's an important shift that's occurring now, and of course I'm not a person that can stay in one blocks of times. That's why I defied distance education wisdom and didn't create blocks of time that corresponded precisely to lectures, because I know that things never go exactly the way I think they're going to. So if you look at the final paragraph in your handout, and it gets us, so it's a transitional kind of thing, and then I'll ask if there are questions, because I think it's an important time to ask questions. All three agreed, and those three would be Franz Boas in the United States, which I associate at least with being the founding person, if there is a founding person, a father of, if you will, modern American anthropology, would be he in the United States. And then if we look to British anthropology, which is the other tradition in anthropology that most collectively is interconnected with our own, most closely is interconnected with our own. And that would be Bronislaw Malinowski and A.R. Radcliffe Brown. That stands for Alfred Reginald. I call him R.B. because it's a much quicker way to write him when I'm using my notes or something. But it's not Mr. Brown. It's anything, if it's better to say R.B. or Radcliffe Brown. Anyway, all three of these folks agreed that the classical evolutionists, these people we've been talking about, were attempting to write history. And they pointed out that to write history of any civilization or of mankind at large required facts. Look how that's biased. Even that point really is capturing or freezing this subsequent periods of anthropological theory in time and seeing how they do not serve us well in terms of modern time. Anyway, they pointed out the right history of any civilization or of mankind at large required facts. History deals with what actually happened. What I'm referring to there is what might be called today the cultural reconstruction of history or the social reconstruction of history. And that is, again, where you use more of what I would find closer in cultural studies or in a postmodern notion of that history never deals with facts, actually, but rather each generation's interpretation of those facts. But at the time of Boas and at the time of Malinowski and Boas, in the subsequent or second periods of anthropological development and anthropological theory of culture, on the one hand, cultural relativism, on the other hand, functionalism and structural functionalism. In those, they felt that history, in the one case, at least in the cultural relativists, as you'll see later on, you don't have to take notes on it now, as you'll see later on, in the one case they felt that history really was something where you were collecting real facts and you were documenting real things and you were recreating and reconstructing events from the past in a real way, and that's what history should be about. Whereas these folks were criticized, these folks I've been talking about for the last 3 or 4 lectures, and they were criticized because they didn't have real history. They hadn't collected real facts. They were totally, if you want to use the word that these folks like, these relativists and functionalists, they did not have real history. They dealt with ethnographies that were ill-reported, that were second-hand, third-hand, fourth-hand sometimes. They did not have empiricism, which is one of the great fascinations of folks that follow in these subsequent periods. These people, other than Tyler and Morgan, did not really go out and study people firsthand and observe what they were talking about. They talked about what other people had told them about. These folks, right? So they were labeled as having a theory, which was the stage theory of savagery, barbarism, and civilization, which in turn they had gotten from or inherited from the Enlightenment scholars. And they took that theory and accepted it as true. Then everything they heard about other people, they pigeonholed. They put into these various substages and stages of cultural development. And somehow that made sense to them. That made it all sound okay. So yeah, there was evidence of peoples inhabiting these areas of the world prior to the advent of, say, modern-day Europeans or Romans or Latins coming into that area. Yeah, they were there, and they were all over the world, different populations. But, they belong. We could explain them. We could organize them. We could understand them by placing them in this kind of organizing scheme, this scheme that details the development of civilization, these different stages in cultural development. And in a way, that is what science about is in one of those more general ways, even in this 19th century, this latter part of the 19th century. It's kind of taking away from the minutiae of detail, showing you what the fundamental stages or categories are, putting your different data or boxes of data into those categories, and somehow in that simplification comes, we think, understanding, and they thought understanding. So you had all these different prehistoric communities and cultures out there, but their emphasis was not on emphasizing the uniqueness of them or the diversity of them, but rather to see how did they fit in the larger scheme of things. And what they felt, the larger scheme of things, was this scheme such as Morgan supplied. So do you have any questions at this point? I would think it's prime for questions, but I may be wrong. Any questions? Yes. Hit your microphone. Show yourself.
It sounds like Morgan and his contemporaries were following the tenets of deductive reasoning, in a scientific approach, which would sound very creditable at this time, but
it's amazingly seductive in modern times. It sounds right. I mean, if I went around the class and I asked any person in the class to, other than our teaching assistant, Mr. Webb, if I ask anyone in the class to, critique this, show us how it doesn't fit, how it doesn't work, most of you, some of you are more sophisticated than others. Obviously, some of you have had more courses and background in anthropology than others. But most of you, rightfully so, would be somewhat, what? You expect me to do that? Because it sounds pretty good to me. I'm willing to grab onto that star and go wherever it takes me. Because it sounds right? It's really it's an informed part of our own culture. It's a part of our cultural tradition. This sounds really good. It's that kind of thing that religious people also find too, and that's revealed truth. Our culture is about this. It's organized around these concepts. So when we hear it, it sounds really good. It's just like, this is one of my favorite examples, a lot of our religious concepts, a lot of our religious notions, a lot of our religious values and attitudes, be they Jewish, Muslim, Catholic, Protestant, whatever, in this area of the world, it's more about the individual. Now, Jewish theologians would take issue with me. Muslim or Islamic scholars would take issue with me. But compared to Muslims and Jewish people in other parts of the world, they're much more individualistic here. And one of the big things between Eastern religion and Western religion is individual salvation. Whereas in Eastern religions and Eastern religious tradition, becoming saved is to throw off the materialist notions, to throw off everything that makes us into individuals, and to realize that which is eternal about us is that which is divine within us. Well, that's not something that speaks to you and me. If I'm going to live forever in heaven, I want to live as Norris Lang. That's what I see, and that's what I see eternal life, if there is such a thing as being about. I want it to be about eternity for Nori. And I don't know where you stand on that, but that I would assume that you would share in that as well. But that is really a cultural value that comes through, that has tenacity, that will last a long time. And that's with this emphasis that we have upon individuality, etc. So when something comes along that supports that, we immediately perceive the truth of it. And I call that revealed truth, and other people do too. So it's the same, these are at that same level of notions, that these make sense. We know that there are Stone Age people, or there are people who were limited to stone tools in terms of their technology. We know agriculture, whatever else we know about it. We know it was a big deal and caused all kinds of changes and implications, such as the ability to have large, dense urban populations. You couldn't have an urban center. You couldn't have a city without agriculture. You would need at least that level of technological sophistication and productivity and carrying capacity that the land would yield in order to be able to have those kinds of dense, compact settlements. You couldn't have that without agriculture as a technology. The same way as I'm wondering all the time, what are the units of social complexity and organization that are coming into being now that you and I are really unaware of because we're in the middle of it? I suspect that the internet will figure very importantly. And by the time people are talking about that, the internet will be passé. Something else will have superseded it, whatever that might be. But that's because, these stages and this stage kind of theory or this kind of presentation of data makes a whole bunch of sense to me. I understand it immediately because I am in a culture that has a linear notion of history. I don't think this moment, for example, is ever going to be repeated in time. It will ever be, all the things that are going on right now will ever be repeated again. And so I say that I think linearly. I am embedded in a culture which promotes the notion of linearity. And I hope most of you understand what I'm saying when I say linear. But in this case, it just means these subsequent stages, one following upon the other, and each stage being somewhat different than the preceding stage. Another point about this scheme that I haven't probably given enough attention to, which I will now underscore, and that is this notion of progress. It's real important to us, this notion of progress. It's an important part of our culture, and it's an important part of this theoretical formulation. Each, just simply spoken, each one of these stages is thought to be less progressive. If you go back in time, if you go forward in time, they're becoming increasingly progressive. Progress is something we really believe in, except for those social thinkers that sometimes have these reservations, and they say, well, we have all this technology and we have all these wonderful developments, but is it really making us any happier as human beings? Our country, our whole political organization is founded upon the pursuit of happiness, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Is it? That's a rhetorical question. But the point is we always have social commentators, social thinkers along the way that kind of disparage the technology that the West is especially identified with in terms of espousing its great contributions. It makes us who we are. We all, our political leaders, our planners, we all think that everyone in the world, and to some extent there seems to be some verification of it, they all want the wonders and byproducts of technology and technological progress and technological development. But it's always seen as progressive. I go back to the time when I remember Volkswagen sedan having a little plastic thing on the side up near the top of the door that if you wanted to turn right, you'd push this button and this little thing would come up and it would show the person behind you that you wanted to turn right. And correspondingly, if you wanted to turn left, there was another little thing that came up on the left, and that showed the person behind that this Volkswagen sedan wanted to turn left. Well, hardly a big deal to you, but it's a big deal to me that I've lived long enough to remember that. But the point is, turn signals were really a real development in terms of automobile technology. It really took a while. I mean, it's so simple now. You push a lever and off it comes. Except that I find most people ignore it. I walk around and how I keep myself in a good humor is I say, oh, it's too bad. All that wonderful new SUV, and they have everything except they forgot to include the turn signals. But we see that as progressive. See, before, you had cars that didn't have turn signals. Now you have the standard technology. No one ever says, well, does that car include turn signals? We don't think of it that way, right? And we don't have to. You all have to know that if you're going to turn left, you stick your arm out the window this way. If you're going to turn right, you do it this way. What if you're going to stop? What do you do? See how many of you, he knows. Anyone else know? Okay, you do this. If I saw someone sticking their arm out the window now, the last thing I would think is that they'll give me a directional signal. They may be greeting me in another way, but I'm not expecting them to tell me which way they're turning or if they're stopping or whatever. But we all have to learn that, and again, that comes from the past. But that's also an appreciation of what if the technology fails. So today I'm hoping that I'm winding up or concluding my discussion of these 19th century folks. And this first chapter, if you will, in our adventure with anthropological theory, the 19th century classical evolutionists and their concern with stages and substages. And again, that led to their preoccupation, I think, with discussions of civilization. So when you read over your readings, when you associate all these things that you're trying to bring together, remember that this is their goal, this is their focus, this is what they wanted to talk about and what they wanted to perceive. And they, in turn, were responding to people who were talking about diffusionism and theologians. So if you can keep that those are all contemporary with each other, and that's who these early anthropologists were speaking to, you'll be much on target. Thanks a lot. See you on Tuesday.